in review of Robert Frost. We've got a number of poems we're going to be reviewing through today of his, and there were some pretty heady things. Unfortunately, with the modernist poetry, you're definitely going to be looking at some in-depth ideas and structure. So without further ado, let's get the ball rolling. So first off, before we get too far into Robert Frost, Robert Frost, one of the kind of marquee elements of his poetry is this concept of ambivalence. If you look up ambivalence, essentially what it means is kind of conflicting emotions, right? So you might have conflicting emotions about, an obligation you have, school, right? You know that, hey, school is helpful for me. It gives me a lot of opportunities, but obviously I don't always want to do the work. And the same thing goes for, sacrifices you have to make, like, hey, going to practice to get better at a sport. I'd rather just play in the games, that kind of thing. Or it might be simple as a suggested place to eat somewhere, right? I'm ambivalent. I really don't care, right? So the question here kind of explored is if ambivalence is a weakness, this idea of conflicting emotion and not just committing to a feeling or a perspective, or could it be considered a strength? Now, if you look at today's culture, we like to keep things in black and white, and we like to choose sides between those things. But what Robert Frost dwells in a great deal is that middle ground, the difficult, the difficult ideas and the paradoxes and so on that is human existence, really. So delve into the complexity of seemingly simple situations, and as you read, it's helpful to notice those things as we're understanding him. So basic elements, which we're going to talk about: the pastoral, okay, so the role of nature, and especially open space and pastures. The colloquial, so we kind of have a little bit of that regionalist sort of element there. And then the metaphysical, which is really where we have kind of a blend of romanticism and modernist views. And again, it's his tone that often takes the modernist perspective there. So for the pastoral, Frost is devoted to land and the natural world. And though he is modern, he's not urban, and he has always found his deep concerns, conflicts, and solutions in relation between human beings and the natural environment. So in a way, he's taking cues from even the British romantics, and the likes of Wordsworth and those guys, and even the fireside poets of America, and the Romantic movement. So although his poems sometimes have an undertone of anxiety, they suggest an old-fashioned voice, a tone of 19th century America. So he seems to be hailing back to the 1800s, when there was still land and space. And it's not that he's not acknowledging the urban world, it's that he's finding inspiration, and he's a voice for the rural space. And even today, there is a great deal of open space and rural space in America that does tend to go unacknowledged. So then we have the colloquial, and this is really more or less dealing with his voice and his verb choice and verbiage. So his poetic diction derives from common speech, is unself-consciously American. So again, we're seeing a more of a natural American tone coming out of him. We see kind of precursor to that, I guess you could argue, with the likes of Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson and their more everyday language. And yet Walt Whitman still has a great deal of cadence and flowery language, you could argue. It's everyday, but it's still meant to be poetic and artistic. And Frost does, quite frankly, even a little less than that. The language is neither high-flown nor artificial. It is unaffected. It's everyday speech. This effect is not easy for any poet to achieve, though, especially if you're making quality poetry. So that's one of the things that makes him a particularly accessible and quality poet, is that he's able to strike this balance with the language that he uses in his poetry versus the actual message and underlying poetic nature of it. So Frost presents this illusion of simplicity in his pastoral stance and his colloquial diction, but behind both lies complex anxieties and doubts, as well as disciplined manipulation of form and language. And that is where ultimately we find this metaphysical part. So this is where we get into the heady stuff of Frost, and he's got a lot there. So I'm going to try my best to try to focus on this really in his poetry. So, like Donne and Eliot, Frost uses things of this world to move beyond the physical into the intangible world of spiritual realities. So things are not what they seem when in a lot of his poetry. It's a conversation about the depths and the fundamental human truths and human nature and so on. Okay, so he uses nature as a revelation of the human soul and of the divine toward which humanity strives. Okay, and unlike the Romantics, in a sense, I think he doesn't necessarily assume that nature offers solution, right? So he uses nature as a revelation of the human soul and of the divine toward which humanity strives. So he understands this struggle, but he doesn't necessarily look at nature as a solution. Nature just reveals the truth of this struggle. Okay, so this is a source of the religious aura that many of Frost's poems have. They suggest a striving to immerse oneself so fully in this world that one can escape from it. And a great example of that, one of the poems we're not reading, is Birches. And in that case, Frost, uses these bent birch trees and comes up with this metaphor, this kid climbing up the birch trees and then swinging down and making this, comment about how it would be great to be a swinger of birch trees and climb all the way up to heaven and then swing all the way back down to earth in this kind of, reincarnation process. But essentially, by completely immersing himself in the world and enjoying what life has to offer, we can ultimately reach, in some ways, the divine, right? This is it. So here we go. We're going to start off with the heavy hitter. So the Road Not Taken is likely his most famous poem and probably his most misunderstood or misquoted poem. So before we even get into this, we need to talk about the title. A lot of the times people read this poem and think it is The Road Less Traveled. And there's this message about, always take the road less traveled, blaze your own trail, da da da. Let me be clear in saying that is not what he is saying in this poem. That is not the message of this poem at all. So it's a very, very commonly misunderstood poem in that sense. So let's read through this poem, and then we're gonna talk about it a little bit. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both, and be one traveler long I stood, and looked down one as far as I could, to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear, though as for that the passing there had warned them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay in leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how a way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere, ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less travelled by, and that has made all the difference. So let's break this poem down by stanza, because it really does merit that. So off the bat, he presents us with this speaker who's walking in the wood, and he comes across two paths, right? And while he wants to take both paths, he's given pause, right? And that's a thing also we're going to see in another poem where he kind of pauses to think about things and which way should I go and what should I do here. But right off the bat, it's just a matter of there's a choice. Now, if we're getting into the metaphysical element of this, what he's doing here is saying life is full of this. Every single moment of our life is full of choice. It's full of, do I do this? Do I do that? How do I spend my time? Do I procrastinate on this? Do I take, am I proactive in this thing? Do I save for a rainy day? Do I spend my money? Do I go to this college? Do I, what do I do? There are always choices before us, right? And these paths fork off and get more and more complex the longer we go down the paths, right? Now, we have two paths, and he's making an assessment of these paths. Now, it says, long I stood, and I looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the other growth, then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear. So he says, I looked down one path, but I took the other because it looked just as good, and perhaps having the better claim, he doesn't know this. Right? He has no clue which path is going to lead to a better fortune for him. And while he says because it was grassy and wanted wear, some people look at that as being, oh, the path must have been less traveled. But then he says this, though as for that, the passing there had warned them really about the same. Critical line there. These paths are no different than each other. At least on the outset, he cannot tell the difference. This is not the path less traveled. So let's move on here. So then it goes, and both that morning equally lay in leaves, no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day, right? He reiterates the fact that they are both the same. And he says, I kept the first for another day. He has a desire to take the other path, but he knows, as it says here, he doubted if he should ever come back, because way leads on to way. We're going to be in a different place. And so in almost a Gatsby-esque sort of thing, or more like Nick Carraway in Gatsby, he recognizes you don't repeat the past. I won't be coming back to this path. It won't be an option. And therein lies where he's giving us a little bit of the metaphysical. Anybody could physically walk back to a different path, But obviously we're talking about life choices here, or at least not obviously, just at least under the surface. So then he says, I shall be telling this with a sigh somewhere ages and ages hence, two roads diverge in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Now he's already told us that these paths were worn about the same. So the idea of I took the one less traveled by is more or less amusing on his part. It's a hope that is what I did, that I chose the one less traveled by, that I chose a path that not a lot of other people took, and that it's made all the difference. Well, it doesn't matter what path you choose, it makes a difference all the time, right? I mean, when you think of, the choices that you make, you cheat on a test, you get caught, and your grade goes down, and that affects your GPA, and now you don't get into that prestigious university, whatever it might be. Or you decided to work really hard, and you got yourself scholarships that got you into the university you wanted, and it gets you the job you wanted, and you find a significant other, and so on, like all the millions of different things that are now changed because of the choices you make. Now, if that causes you anxiety, yes, exactly. This is part of that whole process, that there is a fundamental anxiety in the choices that are made on our daily lives and how they affect our futures. And you can only hope that the choices that you make ultimately make the difference and make for a better life. But again, he's telling it with a sigh. I'm only just hoping, right? Kind of looking back, reminiscing, hindsight 2020. But the truth is he's leaving it not necessarily doubtful, but without true evidence, he'll never know he didn't take the other path. So, for a little bit easier poem, yet still just as complex, we have Fire and Ice. Some say the world will end in fire, some say in ice. From what I tasted of desire, I hold those who favor fire. But if it had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction ice is also great and would suffice. So first off, he presents us with a rather morbid poem about the destruction of the world. And he juxtaposes fire and ice. Now, these are two warring things, right? They're kind of opposites. They cancel each other out. And he gives them emotional attributes, desire and hate. And while he starts off by saying desire is a stronger motivator, a stronger fuel for destruction, right? Causes the great amount of destruction and damage. He also recognizes how hate does that as well, and that how both of fire and ice are likely to destroy, right? They can both do the job when it comes to ending the world, right? And if this isn't a commentary on issues of human nature, I don't know what is. But again, we have desire and hate. These seem like opposites, right? Desire is something you're attracted to. Hate is something you're repelled, right? Fire and ice. And yet, it is these things that somehow are balancing, right, the world in this very, very precarious fashion. And should the balance ever tip, in either way, the world would end. And so there's this conversation about how humanity, the anxiety, the tension, the paradox of human emotion, and that constant tension that we live in here. So I'm going to leave it at that for the sake of running through time, because we've got a lot of stuff to talk about. And stopping by the woods on a snowy evening, this one's a good one. So this one you'll find has a little bit of the flavor of that Two Roads poem here. So let's just jump into this. Who woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake, to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. So let's break this guy down a little bit. So right off the bat, he presents us with this scene in winter time where he's traveling through a man's woods, and he makes this comment how the guy doesn't even know that he's there. Now, why is that important? Why does he even start off with this guy in the village doesn't even know I'm here, right? This trespassing. But he starts off immediately with this thought towards civilization, towards the village, towards this man whose woods are there, right? The man will never know he's been there, though, right? Because nature doesn't necessarily, reveal that. I mean, it's nature. You can walk through it, right? And there's a freedom there, despite the fact that, yes, a man holds a quote ownership of it. So right off the bat, he's presented us with this dichotomy of nature and the ownership of nature that's been brought there, and he just happens to find himself in this man's wood. So then he presents us with this horse, right? And the horse is domesticated. The horse is going, why are we stopping here? There's no farmhouse here. This is not a good idea. Between the woods and frozen lake, those are not safe places to be in the middle of winter, right? The darkest evening of the year, right? And then he adds this foreboding, the darkest evening of the year. This is, right, December, mid-late December here, where, there's least amount of sunlight. This is not a good place to be in the middle of winter, right? And this wood with snow. And the horse seems to know this. There's an instinct here that the horse is indicating by shaking and giving, like, what's going on? What am I doing? And then he, again, throws out this statement, the only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. This beautiful scene that is juxtaposed with this horse's anxiety of why, knows this isn't a good place to be, and I'm a horse and I wouldn't want to be out here, and instinct tells me this is not good. And yet the man continues to muse. The woods are lovely, dark, and deep. And when we break that down, we have lovely. There's a beauty to it, and yet there's this power, destructive power, dark and deep. It's mysterious. And suddenly we might think to ourselves, are we talking about the woods? Because what the woods are representing here is mortality, is death. You stick around too long here, you're going to die. And there's something compelling. There's something beautiful about that, in this kind of don't fear the reaper sort of thing almost. But it's just a moment. This man is just caught with the beauty and the power of nature. And death itself, yes, is a part of nature. And it's like he's stopping for a moment to muse about all this, that this beautiful scene of the snow, which is very dangerous for him, still presents him with an interesting concept. And yet he's pulled away right in those last lines. But I have promises to keep. Again, he runs back into that civilization. Wherever he's going, whatever he's doing, he has an obligation there. And miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. And he repeats that twice there, right? Not simply, I still have to get out of these woods and get back to a safe place in the village before I can rest for the night. But I have things to take care of in my life. I have a job to do. I have goals. I have some objective before I get to die, right? And he repeats that multiple times over. So again, we have that metaphysical going on. And then this poem we do a little bit different when it comes to even the form here. He does a little bit more sing-song, There's a consistent rhyme scheme. There's the quatrains, and the very kind of clear, clean, bite-sized ideas in each one of these stanzas, which has made this poem a particularly famous one. It also was parodied quite a bit. There's, stopping by a bakery on a morning run or something along those lines. So there's a whole bunch of those there, but all of them again are kind of exploring these choices, these ideas, and the temptation, especially the temptation of not necessarily death, but of destruction in a sense. So yeah, so let's move on. We've got a couple more to go. After apple picking, we'll just do this one as quick as we can here. So again, this is where he's got a little bit more of the pastoral. It doesn't fall as much into a meter as you can, or at least a form as you can see. But nevertheless, we have still some of that metaphysical, so let's read. My long two-pointed ladders, sticking through a tree toward heaven still. And there's a barrel that I didn't fill beside it, and there may be 2 or 3 apples I didn't pick upon some bough. But I am done with apple picking now. Essence of winter sleep is on the night, the scent of apples. I am drowsing off. I cannot rub the strangeness from my sight. I got from looking through a pane of glass. I skimmed this morning from the drinking trough, and held against the world of hoary grass. It melted, and I let it fall and break, but I was well, upon my way to sleep before it fell, and I could tell what form my dreaming was about to take. What form my dreaming was about to take. Sorry, magnified apples appear and disappear, stem and end and blossom end, and every fleck of russet showing clear. My instep arch not only keeps the ache, it keeps the pressure of the ladder round. I feel the ladder sway as the boughs bend, and I keep hearing from the cellar bin the rumbling sound of load on load of apples coming in. For I have had too much of apple picking, I am overtired of the great harvest I myself desired. There were 10,000 fruit to touch, cherish in hand, lift down and not let fall. For all that struck the earth, no matter if not bruised or spiked with stubble, went surely to the cider apple heap, as of no worth. One can see what will trouble this sleep of mine, whatever sleep it is. Were he not gone, the woodchuck could say whether it's like his long sleep, as I describe its coming on, or just some human sleep. So let's break this down. We've got a couple questions to look at. So the tone of the speaker in this poem, right? We would say he's probably kind of weary, right? But then the question comes down to, is he weary from just work of picking apples? Because that's a weird poem to write, just about I'm tired from picking apples all day long, right? We'll see a little bit as we analyze this. We're going to go back a little bit, but before we go into that, let's talk about a little more. The idea of labor and sleep operate on literal and figurative levels here, as we can see. On the literal level, Frost refers to a hard day's labor and the slumber at the end of the day. But on the figurative level, we've got something else going on, right? And the apples themselves seem to represent maybe more than simply just apples, right? And at what point do you begin to see the poem is not merely about picking apples? We're going to run through that, and then the sound and rhythm in the poem. So looking back at this, we do have a rhyme scheme, and we do in some ways have a meter that he breaks off every once in a while with just a couple of words here and there, right? But I was well, and I could tell for all were he not gone. So he doesn't keep consistent blank verse. And he does have rhyme. And again, that rhyme scheme is complex. It does not necessarily follow a complete pattern. But as we look through this poem, he's talking about talking about this hard day's work, right? And how he's drowsing off from a hard day's work, right? And the night is falling and so on. And I cannot rub the strangeness from my sight I got from looking through a pane of glass I skimmed this morning from the drinking trough, and held against the world of hoary grass. It melted and I let fall and break, right? So it's almost as if he's talking about like a piece of of ice or a pane of glass that he just found, and he's looking through it, and the world is kind of fuzzy. It's not making sense. And he's saying, I can't really seem to shake that, right? And he says, I was well upon my way to sleep before it fell, and I could tell what form my dreaming was about to take. Magnified apples appear and disappear, stem and end and blossom end, and every fleck of russet showing clear. So, in his dream, he was going to remember things clearly, and he was going to feel the ache of all these different things, right? And the fact that he was on his way to sleep before it fell, right, is if he's not able to see things clearly except for in his dreams. The dream reality that he's dealing with, okay, doesn't make much sense until he finally goes back to sleep. And then we have this conversation. He goes on, I keep hearing from the cellar bin the rumbling sound of load on load of apples coming in, right? And this is all the stuff that's in his mind, right? Because he's been picking apples all day. And yet, he's overtired from the great harvest I myself desired. Now, if we take this on the more metaphysical, this is a guy who's really talking about, again, life itself, the choices we make, the actions we take, that there are thousands of fruit to touch and things to do, cherish in hand, lift down and not let fall, right? As if these are things we can screw up, right? That all the things, for all that struck the earth, no matter if not bruised or spiked with stubble, went surely to the cider heap, right? They are now with sin. They're now, you know, they're now unclean, and they are no longer able to be used in a value, right? They go to the cider heap. Well, we have a use for them somehow, but not in their pristine and beautiful condition that those you managed to keep hold of, right? And then he says, one can see with what will trouble this sleep of mine, whatever sleep it is. It's this question, well, are all these things important? Is all this effort I'm making of value? To what end does it all, come to? So he then brings it back to nature. Woodchuck could say whether it's like his long sleep, right? A hibernation, or is it a human sleep, right? Is this a long sleep, or is this just a short-lived one where I have to go back to work the next day and go through the next grind? So what is the system? What is the cycle here that I'm ultimately in? So again, that more metaphysical thing. So last poem here is Mending Wall. So a couple of things. We've been kind of talking about this ambivalence in all of the poems in some ways, and this dichotomy or this paradox that he presents us with of life and life choices and so on. So form and content, word choice, connotative words, and then several themes and meanings within the poem. This one's a little bit longer, but it's also a fantastic poem. So let's just get on with it. So, something there is that doesn't love a wall, that sends the frozen ground swell under it and spills the upper boulders in the sun, and makes gaps even two can pass abreast. The work of hunters is another thing. I have come after them and made repair, where they have left no one stone on a stone. But they would have the rabbit out of hiding to please the yelping dogs. The gaps, I mean. No one has seen them made or heard them made, but at spring mending time we find them there. I let my neighbor know beyond the hill, and on a day we meet to walk the line and set the wall between us once again. Keep the wall between us as we go. To each the boulders that have fallen to each, and some are loaves and some are so nearly balls, we have to use a spell to make them balance. Stay where you are until our backs are turned. We wear our fingers rough with handling them. Oh, just another kind of outdoor game, one on a side. It comes to little more. There where it is, we do not need the wall. There where it is, we do not need the wall. Sorry. He is all pine, and I am all apple orchard. My apple trees will never get across and eat the cones under his pines. I tell him. He only says, good fences make good neighbors. Spring is the mischief in me, and I wonder if I could put a notion in his head. Why do they make good neighbors? Isn't it where there are cows? But here there are no cows. Before I build a wall, I'd ask to know what it was, or what I was walling in or walling out, and to whom I was like to give offence. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that wants it down. I could say elves to him, but it's not elves exactly, and I'd rather he said it for himself. I see him there bringing a stone grasped firmly by the top in each hand, like an old stone savage armed. He moves in darkness, as it seems to me, not of woods only and the shade of trees. He will not go behind his father's saying, and he likes having thought of it so well. He says again, good fences make good neighbors. Whew! Okay, good stuff. So we have conflicting statements, and we're going to start off right off the bat. Our narrator acknowledges something. Something there is that doesn't love a wall. So here's the deal. This is a pastoral poem. We've got two neighbors. There's a big stone wall between their properties, and yet one of them has apple orchards and one of them has pine trees. There's nothing that's technically going between these places. So he then begs the question, so why do we need a wall? Now, before we really address his attitude, he presents us with the fact that nature itself tears this wall down, that sends the frozen ground swell under it. There's a thing called frost heave that does this, right? When the ground gets really frozen, just like ice or whatever, and it will expand a little bit, and it tends to knock over walls, especially if they're precarious. And he even goes and saying, there are hunters, and yet the hunters are brought to break down the wall because of nature, because a rabbit or something is taking refuge in it, so they want to get at it. But nature itself ultimately is what brings this thing down, right? In to the point that even two people can pass next to each other through the wall. So it's not just boulder here, boulder there. It's wall breaks down pretty well, even over a season. So our narrator, our speaker acknowledges this, and yet our neighbor has this saying, good fences make good neighbors. Now, on the outset, we all go, well, yeah, it's good to know your property lines. It's good to know to keep this distinction between me and this other person, right? And so we're presented with this dichotomy, this separate, that, well, nature doesn't want this wall, and yet humanity understands we need them, right? This is a man-made thing. This wall is not a natural thing. Yes, we have natural borders in the world, right? And rivers and mountains and things of that nature, but this wall is a man-made thing, and nature itself breaks that down too. So we have this idea about the symbolic nature of this wall, right? And then our attitude about the wall, and our speaker's attitude about the wall. So let's break this down. First off, the speaker himself is the one that it's important to note, is the one who calls him out, right? But at spring mending time we find them there. I let my neighbor know beyond the hill, and one day we meet to walk the line, right? So this guy who himself recognizes nature doesn't want this wall is the one who calls his neighbor to do this, right? It's not the neighbor who says, hey, we should do this, right? It's the guy who's speaking here. And they go along on either side. They keep the wall between them. And again, paradoxically, him doing this is what makes him a good neighbor. Him going to his neighbor and saying, hey, let's mend the wall, technically brings them closer together, both physically and in respectfulness, right? That us doing this is part of what, helps keep us close, keep those distinctions. That separation in some ways is part of how this all works in civilization, right? But again, we're then presented with this idea about, I see him there bringing a stone grasped firmly by the top in each hand, like an old stone savage armed, right? This seems to hail from like a past, this old tradition, this barbaric tradition, right? That good fences make good neighbors. It's an old, ancient idea. It's not modern. It's not progressive. And he recognizes this. And yet, it is where we are. It is maybe a hailing back from the ancient, more violent and primitive, behavior of man that we still have yet to eradicate, and therefore good fences make good neighbors. So he brings us to this idea, and it's really our choice, right? We understand that, yeah, fences are both necessary and also not natural, right? So a lot of metaphysical stuff going on there. Some of the word choice that he uses, analyze that for a great deal of time. But for that, we'll leave it at that. Thanks for watching. Hopefully you're enjoying this Frost poetry. I know it was a long presentation, but thank you for humoring me and getting through it. Hopefully it was a little bit easier than simply answering piles of questions on your own. So talk to you next time, guys. Thanks.